Chapter 1, The Heartthrob Who Will Never Notice Me. The lecture hall buzzed in that particular early morning way. Half-awake chatter, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of backpacks against scuffed tile. Scott Hayes kept his hood up until the last possible second, hunching over his notebook like he could disappear behind the careful lines of handwriting. His sleeves were tugged over his palms, fingers curled around his pen as if it could anchor him. He didn't mind mornings. He minded being seen. But everyone else seemed wide awake, already talkative, already comfortable in their own skin. Scott skimmed the notes for last lecture, hair falling into his eyes as always. He blew it away without thinking. No one noticed. Then the door banged open. Garrett Sinclair walked in with sunlight at his back. Literally. The rising sun streamed through the high windows behind him, throwing warm gold across his blonde hair and the worn varsity jacket hanging off his broad shoulders. His steps were unhurried, confident, casual, in that way that probably couldn't be taught. He pushed a hand through his hair, making it messier and somehow even better, and laughed when someone called his name. That laugh always did something odd in Scott's chest, too warm, too bright. Scott pretended to write something, but his eyes flicked up traitorously. Garrett was magnetic without trying. People turned, waved, called out for him to sit with them. His girlfriend, Olivia, waved from a seat near the middle. Dark hair twisted neatly, soft sweater sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She looked like she belonged in a museum of soft, gentle things. When Garrett walked toward her, her smile grew, easy and familiar. She nudged a stack of books aside so Garrett could sit. They were the kind of couple you saw in university brochures. Scott returned to his notes. His chest tightened in a way he wished it didn't. Garrett Sinclair, pre-med star, soccer forward, universally adored, dating Olivia Park since freshman year. The kind of person you fall for in movies, as Scott privately thought, but never said out loud. He knew better than to be obvious. He convinced himself, as he always did, that Garrett would never notice him, that it was safe to admire from far away, that the ache in his chest would stay small as long as he kept it secret. The professor arrived, tapping on the projector screen to get everyone's attention, and Scott straightened. He forced his eyes to the front. But every time Garrett shifted, every time he laughed, Scott felt something in him stir. Too bright, too beautiful, too impossible. He'll never see me. That's safe, Scott repeated silently, pressing the words like a bruise. Then the professor said the words that shattered that illusion in one blow. All right, everyone. Group project this semester, randomly assigned. Names going up on the screen now. Scott's stomach dropped. A soft electric murmur spread through the hall as names flickered onto the projector. Scott skimmed the list, then froze. Scott Hayes, Garrett Sinclair, Olivia Park, and one other classmate he barely recognized. Oh no, his pulse spiked. His breath caught somewhere between ribs. He'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of staying invisible, of admiring Garrett from safe distances, a hallway, a soccer game, the back of a classroom, not sharing a grade. Not being forced into conversation, into eye contact, into proximity that would set his nerves and his attraction on fire. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. This couldn't be happening. When the class ended, Scott packed slowly, hoping to slip out unseen. But someone blocked his way with a shadow that fell across his open notebook. Scott, right? He looked up. Garrett stood there with that easy smile, like they weren't strangers. His golden hair caught the overhead lights, making him look like he lived under perpetual sunshine. He reached out a hand, large, warm, calloused from soccer. You always ask the good questions in class, Garrett said. Nice to actually meet you. Scott stared at the hand for a full second too long before taking it. Garrett's palm was warm, so warm. His grip was firm but gentle. Scott tried pulling back quickly, embarrassed at the flush creeping into his neck. Garrett didn't let go immediately. It was just a heartbeat of extra time, a heartbeat that made Scott's heart misfire. Oh yeah, Scott managed, barely audible. Nice to meet you too. Garrett's smile grew a notch softer, more real, and that terrified Scott more than anything. The first group study session met in the library 2 days later. Scott arrived early because of course he did. He'd rather die than be late. He claimed a small table near the windows, spreading out notes with neat precision. The smell of old books calmed him. One by one, notifications pinged on his phone. Olivia, running late. Psych lab overran. Sorry, guys. Group mate number 4. Can't make ash. Y'all got it, though. Save me a seat. A seat. Scott exhaled slowly, cheeks heating. He typed a brief sure, then immediately regretted typing anything at all. Minutes later, a shadow fell across the table again. Garrett dropped into the chair beside Scott, breath slightly quick from jogging, hair wind-ruffled. "Sorry I'm late," he said, placing his backpack down. "Professor cornered me after lab. You know how she is." Scott nodded automatically, though he barely absorbed the words. Because Garrett was sitting close, very close. Their chairs brushed. Garrett's shoulder radiated warmth through Scott's hoodie. "Looks like it's just us for now," Garrett said, laughing softly. Scott's heart thudded. They opened one laptop between them. The table was small. There was no choice but to lean in. Knee bumped knee. Scott jerked, but Garrett didn't move away. If anything, he settled, letting the contact remain like it was natural. The warmth seeped through Scott's jeans straight into his bones. He inhaled, and Garrett's cologne, clean cedar, warm citrus, filled his senses. It made him dizzy. He forced himself to focus on the screen. Garrett pointed to a diagram, leaning in further. His breath brushed Scott's cheek, soft, warm, too close. Scott's fingers trembled on the trackpad. Garrett noticed. A small flicker crossed his hazel eyes. Concern, curiosity, something else Scott couldn't name. "You okay?" Garrett asked, voice low. "You're shaking." Scott muttered something about too much caffeine, though he hadn't had any. Garrett didn't call him out, just hummed softly and closed the gap between their chairs even more, like proximity helped him focus. They fell into conversation. Unexpectedly easy, unexpectedly warm. Garrett confessed he hated organic chemistry. "You'd think pre-med would come naturally to me, right? But Orgo has it out for me personally." Scott huffed a laugh, unable to help it. "You don't seem like someone who struggles." Garrett blinked at him as if surprised. "Everyone struggles, Scott. People just pretend they don't." That softened something tight inside Scott. He found himself saying, quietly, "I study because I don't really have a safety net. If I mess up, I can't afford it." Garrett turned to him fully, expression gentler than Scott expected. "That sounds like a lot to carry," he said softly. "You're doing amazing." Scott's breath hitched. He couldn't take this closeness, this attention, this vulnerability. It cracked open something he'd sealed for years. So he panicked. I have another class," he blurted, packing up. "I should go." Garrett blinked, confused. "Right now? Sorry." Scott shoved his things into his bag, nearly knocking over a chair, and fled. Behind him, Garrett sat there staring after him, brow furrowed, puzzled, a little hurt, and unexpectedly intrigued. By Thursday, Scott tried returning to routine. He had his safe place, the campus cafe. He worked the evening shift, wearing an apron that actually made him feel normal, comfortable, invisible. Then Garrett walked in with Olivia. They looked right together. Olivia with her warm brown eyes and easy smile, Garrett with his arms slung over her shoulders. They laughed about some inside joke, leaning into each other in the way of people who shared years of memories. Scott's chest squeezed painfully, but he forced a polite smile. "What can I get you guys?" Olivia beamed. "Scott, right?" She'd read his name tag. "Can we get a caramel latte and a black coffee?" Her voice was bright without being loud. Everything about her was gentle. Garrett added, "Make it one of your good coffees. You always make them better than the others." Scott's hand paused on the cup. He shouldn't know how to respond to that. He shouldn't feel warmth bloom in his chest because of it. He prepared the drinks carefully. He shouldn't have cared, but he wanted Garrett's coffee to be perfect. Pathetic. From behind the counter, he watched them quietly. Garrett wiped foam from Olivia's lip, grinning. Olivia shoved him lightly. "Stop being cute in public." Garrett laughed. She laughed. It was easy, familiar, loving. Scott swallowed hard. "This is fine," he told himself. "I can like him secretly. Just never let him know. Never get close enough to ruin anything." He repeated it until his chest hurt less. Near closing time, rain hammered softly against the windows. Scott rolled down the shutters halfway, starting cleanup. The cafe was empty except for the hum of the espresso machine. The door chimed. Scott looked up and froze. Garrett slipped in, hoodie damp from the drizzle, hair darkened and sticking to his forehead. He looked softer at night, tired but warm, edges gentler without the daytime spotlight. "Sorry," Garrett said, brushing water from his sleeves. "Am I too late?" Scott shook his head quickly. "No, you're good." Garrett exhaled with visible relief. "Great. Can you make me whatever keeps you awake at this hour?" Scott blinked. Sure." Garrett leaned on the counter, chin resting on his hand, watching Scott with shameless interest while he worked. Scott tried focusing on the espresso pour, but Garrett's gaze felt like warm sunlight on skin. "You always look so focused." Garrett said quietly. It's kind of impressive. Scott nearly dropped the cup. Garrett continued, voice even softer, almost embarrassed. I've wanted to say hi for a while. Scott's breath caught. You what? Garrett shrugged, smile crooked. You look like someone worth knowing. Scott couldn't breathe for a moment. He handed Garrett the finished drink, hoping his hands wouldn't shake. Garrett reached out, and their fingers brushed. A slow, intentional slide of skin against skin. Garrett's thumb skimmed over Scott's knuckles in a way that didn't feel accidental. His eyes flicked up, warm, thoughtful, almost searching. Scott felt the warmth all the way to his ears. Thanks, Garrett murmured. He left with the cup, rain misting behind him. Just before the door swung shut, Garrett looked back once. Scott stood frozen, heart thudding like something alive inside him. He spent the night replaying that tiny brush of fingers, convinced it meant nothing, but unable to shake how Garrett's thumb had lingered. Unable to forget that look, the one that felt like being seen. Chapter 2. Why do you look at me like that? The cafeteria at noon was loud in the way that made Scott's skin feel too thin. Forks scraping, people laughing, chairs squeaking, the whole place vibrated with energy he never quite fit into. He found a corner table, opened his laptop, and tried to pretend that the world shrank down to the brightness of the screen. He could disappear here. Usually. He'd barely taken 2 bites of his sandwich when a tray dropped onto the table beside him with a clatter that made him jump. Room at this table? Scott turned, already bracing for someone to tell him they needed the space. Instead, his breath simply stopped. Garrett Sinclair stood over him, holding a tray of food and smiling like this was the most natural thing in the world. Blonde hair, slightly damp from the drizzle outside, cheeks faintly pink from the cold, hoodie sleeves pushed to his elbows. He looked like a warm breeze in human form. Sure, Scott said, because what else could he say? Garrett slid into the seat beside him, not across, beside, close enough that his shoulder brushed Scott's with the smallest shift. Conversations around them broke, picked up again with new whispers. Is he sitting with him? Since when are they friends? Lucky. Scott wanted the floor to open. Garrett didn't seem to notice at all. He nudged his tray closer to Scott's, sliding the fries into the middle like he was sharing with someone he'd eaten lunch with 100 times. You study too much, Garrett said lightly, glancing at Scott's laptop screen. Take a break before your brain explodes. Scott made a sound that was supposed to be a laugh. I don't study that much. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Scott, you were in the library at midnight 2 days ago. Scott froze. You? Saw me? Uh-huh. Garrett stole a fry and pointed it at him like a teacher with a piece of chalk. And I bet you were there the night before that, too. And the night before that. Scott mumbled something evasive, but his ears were burning. Garrett grinned like he found it all charming. He nudged the fries closer again. Eat. I'm not taking no for an answer. Scott gave in because it was easier than arguing, and because refusing Garrett felt like refusing sunlight. Their shoulders bumped again. And again. Garrett didn't move away. If anything, he leaned in. The warmth made Scott's stomach twist. Olivia arrived 10 minutes later, spotting them from across the cafeteria before walking over with a soft smile. Scott sat up straighter, bracing for he didn't even know what. Suspicion? Annoyance? The cold, polite edge girlfriends usually had when another guy sat too close to their boyfriend? But Olivia Park was the kind of person who always seemed to brighten the room without trying. She wore a cream-colored sweater, her long dark hair tied back with a silk ribbon, and she approached with a warmth that disarmed him. You're Scott, right? She said, sliding into the seat across from them. The legendary note-taker? Scott stared. What? Garrett groaned beside him. Olivia. I don't call him that. She nudged him under the table with her foot. You may not call him that, but you've definitely described him like that. Scott tried to process that without combusting. I just take notes. Really good ones, Garrett muttered, looking down at his fries. His cheeks actually pinked, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. Olivia laughed softly, then turned back to Scott. He keeps quoting you when he's studying, she said. It's kind of cute. Scott wanted to melt straight into the floor. As they talked, Olivia's eyes flicked between Scott and Garrett in a way that made Scott nervous. Not judgmental, just observant. Her expression softened every time Scott said something that made Garrett laugh. She paid attention to things Scott wished she wouldn't notice. He tried not to read into it, tried not to feel the tiny threads pulling him closer to something he absolutely wasn't allowed to want. And the guilt hit harder than the blush. Olivia was kind, beautiful, thoughtful. Everything Scott wasn't, and Garrett clearly adored her. What Scott felt, it wasn't allowed to go anywhere. So why did Garrett keep sitting so close? Why did he keep leaning in? Why did he look at Scott like he actually cared? They reserved a tiny glass study room later in the week to work on the project. The room was warm, almost humid, probably from the broken ventilation. Olivia had sent a message 15 minutes ago. "Sorry guys, Psych Club emergency meeting, can you handle it without me?" Groupmate number 4 never answered at all. So it was just Scott and Garrett again. The cramped room had 2 wobbly chairs and 1 small sofa. Garrett immediately tested the chairs, both wobbled. He shot Scott a helpless look. "Sofa it is," Scott swallowed. "Okay." They sat side by side, shoulders touching, thighs pressed flush. It wasn't deliberate, there just wasn't space, but that didn't make it easier. The air felt too thick. Garrett stretched his arms along the back of the sofa, relaxing into the cushions. The back of his hand almost brushed Scott's shoulder, almost resting there, warm and tempting. Scott tried focusing on the laptop. Garrett twisted to grab a textbook from his bag, and his shirt rode up, just an inch, exposing a strip of warm, toned stomach. Tight muscle. Smooth skin. Scott's eyes flicked there before he could stop himself. He looked away so fast he almost got whiplash. But Garrett had seen. His lips twitched, just slightly. Something like satisfaction flickering in his eyes before he settled back in place, shifting even closer until their thighs pressed from knee to hip. Scott's entire body went hot. Garrett clicked open the shared document. "Okay," he said lightly. "Let's divide the presentation sections." But the casual tone didn't match the warmth in his eyes, or the closeness of his body, or the way he seemed perfectly content to share breath. Eventually, the conversation slid into something deeper, unplanned. Garrett leaned back, head resting against the cushion, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Do you ever feel like you're not allowed to mess up?" Scott blinked. Yeah, constantly." Garrett let out a humorless laugh. "Same. I feel like everyone's watching me all the time, waiting for me to be the perfect pre-med student, perfect boyfriend, perfect guy." Scott hesitated. "Is that hard?" Garrett finally looked at him. Really looked. His hazel eyes were softer than Scott had ever seen. "Sometimes I feel like everyone's in love with this idea of me," Garrett said quietly. "Not the real me." Scott's voice dropped to a whisper. "The real you is pretty great too." Garrett stared at him like the words were something precious, something forbidden, something dangerous. Scott's breath caught. He had to look away or he'd do something stupid. Later that week, the library was nearly empty when Scott settled into his favorite seat, a quiet corner with warm lamplight and a wide table. He opened his laptop, ready to lose himself in code until the world felt manageable again. But then a familiar voice said, "Is this seat taken?" He jumped. Garrett stood there holding 2 coffees, his hair messy from the wind, his hoodie zipped half open over a white t-shirt that made Scott's brain short-circuit for a moment. Garrett didn't wait for an answer. He just sat, sliding 1 coffee toward Scott. "For you. You look like you need it." Scott blinked. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." Garrett smiled, small, tired, real, and opened his own laptop. For the next hour, they worked in silence, knees brushing under the table, breaths occasionally sinking. Every so often, Garrett's head drooped toward Scott's shoulder, closer, until he jolted awake at the last second and laughed at himself. Scott tried not to imagine what it would feel like if Garrett's head actually rested there. Eventually, the silence broke. "What do you want to do after graduation?" Garrett asked softly, like the dark made honesty easier. Scott hesitated, then admitted, "I want to design software that helps people. Something meaningful. Something useful." Garrett watched him with a strange expression. Fond, intense. "That fits you." Scott looked down, heart thudding. "What about you?" he asked. Garrett sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Everyone assumes med school, and I like helping people, but I don't know if that's the only way, or if it's what I want, or what everyone expects." Scott looked at him. Really looked. The gold hair, the tired eyes, the tension beneath the smile. "You're allowed to want something different," Scott said gently. Garrett's breath hitched. And then he stared. Longer than was appropriate, longer than was safe. Scott turned away first. A few evenings later, Garrett and Olivia walked arm in arm down a campus path at dusk. The sky was lavender and gold, leaves stirring in a gentle breeze. Olivia's hand tightened slightly on his arm. Garrett, I feel like we're drifting a little. Garrett exhaled slowly. I know, I'm sorry. She shook her head. Don't be sorry, just be honest with me. He hesitated. I've been stressed and confused and busy. It's not you. Olivia studied him with soft, perceptive eyes. You seem lighter after studying with Scott. Garrett's step faltered. She didn't accuse. She didn't cry. She didn't even look hurt. Just thoughtful. I think we should talk soon, she said gently. Really talk. He nodded. Yeah, we should. They hugged under a street lamp. It wasn't a breakup, but it wasn't nothing. The next day, Scott and Garrett walked across the campus green, sharing headphones. Garrett had given him one earbud, the cord brushing their jackets. Their arms brushed with each step. Garrett didn't move away. Scott tried focusing on the music, but the brush of skin on skin was like static in his veins. At one point, wind blew Scott's hair across his face. He tried to tuck it behind his ear, but before he could, Garrett reached out, gently, carefully. His fingers brushed Scott's temple, sweeping the strands away. His touch lingered for half a second. Warm, soft, almost thoughtful. Scott froze. Garrett's eyes flicked down to Scott's lips. A moment. Just a moment. But enough to ignite something low and deep inside Scott's chest. Then Garrett pulled back, hands in his pockets like nothing happened. Scott didn't breathe until they reached the library steps. And that night, lying in bed, hugging his pillow like it might hold him together, he whispered into the dark. He has a girlfriend. He's just kind. But he didn't quite believe it anymore. Chapter 3. Don't fall for me. I'm not available. The morning light spilling into the campus cafe made everything look softer, warmer. It was early enough that only a few students lingered, hunched over laptops or half-awake conversations. In the far corner, tucked beside a window streaked with condensation, Garrett and Olivia sat facing one another. No one else seemed to notice the tension between them, but it was unmistakable. It lived in the way Olivia's hands lingered around her coffee cup, fingers tightening and loosening. It lived in the way Garrett kept tracing invisible circles on the table with one fingertip. They weren't avoiding each other's eyes. If anything, they were holding one another's gaze too steadily, like people who knew exactly what was coming and were gathering strength to face it. Olivia was the first to speak. I love you, she said softly, voice steady though her lips trembled at the edges. You know that. Garrett swallowed. I know. But I also think. She inhaled deeply, eyes shimmering. I think we've grown in different directions. He shut his eyes for a moment, head bowing like those words landed exactly where he'd been afraid they would. You're right, he whispered. Olivia reached across the table, taking his hand. We're not fighting. We're not hurting each other. We're just changing. Garrett squeezed her fingers gently. I feel like I've been failing you. Not because of anything you've done, just because I've been lost. I don't know what I want anymore, and that's not fair to you. Her eyes softened with understanding. Not suspicion, not anger, just kindness. It's okay to change, Garrett. He blinked rapidly, the shine in his eyes betraying how much those words hit him. And it's not because of anyone else, Olivia added firmly. It's because we're not the freshmen who started dating anymore. Garrett let out a shudder of breath. I'm grateful for you. I hope you know that. I do, she said. But I also want you to be with someone who makes you breathe easier. His chest tightened. Her thumbs stroked his knuckles, gentle and goodbye-shaped. Go find what that is. They leaned across the table, foreheads brushing for a second, and then Olivia kissed his cheek, soft and final. Garrett held her hands for one last moment before letting go. They didn't break in anger or bitterness, just quiet ache. They stood, hugged tightly, and then walked out opposite doors. And that was the end of something tender, and the beginning of something neither yet fully understood. Scott heard the news in the lecture hall, not from Garrett, but from whispers behind him. Did you hear? Garrett and Olivia split. Yeah, this morning. It was mutual. I knew they were drifting. Wonder what happened. Scott's heart dropped straight through the bottom of his stomach. He had no right to feel guilt, none. But it hit him anyway, sharp and cold. Like his crush, his wanting, his weakness had somehow seeped into the universe and caused this. He packed his things quickly, hands shaking. His chest felt tight, too tight. I need to stay away from him. I need to give him space. I cannot be a rebound. I cannot be the reason he hurts. He repeated the words like a mantra as he moved through the halls, head down, hoodie up, hoping he wouldn't see Garrett. But Garrett found him before he could escape. Scott! Scott froze mid-step. Garrett jogged toward him, hair slightly mussed from wind, eyes a little red but bright, too familiar, too close. "Hey," Garrett said, breathless. "Can we hang out after class? Maybe grab coffee?" I could really use—" "Sorry," Scott blurted. I have to go. I have a thing." Garrett blinked. "What thing?" Scott backed up. "Just something." The confusion that crossed Garrett's face cut deeper than Scott expected, like he'd been expecting comfort, and instead got a door slammed shut. "I'll talk to you later," Scott mumbled, turning before he could be convinced otherwise. He didn't see the hurt that flickered across Garrett's expression as he watched him go. Rain hammered against the windows that night, wind rattling the thin dorm walls. Scott sat at his desk with his laptop open, but no amount of code or homework could distract him. He'd reread the same sentence for 20 minutes without processing a single word. His thoughts kept circling back to Garrett. Garrett's confused face, the way his voice had cracked on the question, the faint redness around his eyes. Scott squeezed his eyes shut. "I'm doing the right thing. He needs space. He needs time. He doesn't need me," thunder cracked across the sky. And then, a knock on the door. Scott stared, heart leaping. He wasn't expecting anyone. His chest tightened with a wild, irrational hope he tried to stamp down. He opened the door anyway. Garrett stood there, hoodie damp from rain, hair plastered slightly against his forehead, water droplets trailing down his neck. His hazel eyes looked tired and raw, vulnerability written across every line of him. "Hey," Garrett said softly. Scott's breath hitched. "You ran away today." Garrett's voice was quiet but steady. "Did I do something wrong?" Scott felt his chest cave in. No, you didn't." "Well, it felt like I did," Garrett murmured, stepping inside when Scott hesitated and then moved aside. "And I didn't want to go home yet." Garrett stood in the small room like he didn't know what to do with his hands, so he shoved them in his hoodie pockets. The air smelled like rain and the warmth of him, damp cotton and clean skin. Scott closed the door, heart pounding. Garrett sat on the bed heavily, shoulders slumped, hands hanging loosely between his knees. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. "Olivia and I broke up." Scott's breath stopped. Garrett stared at the floor. "We talked. We ended things. It was mutual. It was kind. It still hurts." Scott sat beside him, closer than he meant to. Their shoulders touched, just a brush, but Garrett sucked in a small breath like that contact was an anchor. "I'm sorry," Scott whispered. Garrett shook his head. "Don't be. It was right. It just—" He exhaled shakily. "It's a lot." Without thinking, Scott touched his forearm. Lightly, tentatively. Garrett's muscles tensed, then relaxed under his touch. "It wasn't because of—" Scott began. Garrett shook his head immediately. "No, it wasn't because of anyone else. We just changed." The storm outside grew louder. Lightning flashed through the curtains, and quietly enough that it felt forbidden. Garrett leaned into him. Scott froze. Then slowly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Garrett rested his head on Scott's shoulder. Scott's heart thundered against his ribs. Their thighs touched, their arms grazed. Scott's breath grew shallow as he lifted an arm and let it wrap around Garrett's back, fingers brushing the warm fabric of his hoodie. Garrett's hand slid around Scott's waist, hesitant, searching, then curled into the fabric, holding tight. The intimacy wrapped around them, subtle but overwhelming. Scott's free hand rose on its own to stroke the back of Garrett's neck, soft hair, warm skin, tension he wanted to soothe forever. Garrett shivered. Then he lifted his head just enough that their faces hovered inches apart. The air between them tightened until Scott could barely breathe. Garrett's eyes flicked to Scott's lips. His fingers flexed at Scott's waist. His breath hitched. "Can I?" he whispered, voice barely a sound. Scott's eyes fluttered shut, but something inside him seized. He pulled back a fraction of an inch, chest trembling. "You're hurting," he whispered, throat tight. "I can't. I don't want to be something you regret." Garrett stared at him like Scott had said something heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. Then he pressed his forehead softly to Scott's. Their breaths mingled. Their noses brushed. Not a kiss, just the ghost of one. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing each other in, wanting, not daring. Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked. The power flickered, then died. The room plunged into darkness. Garrett let out a soft, shaky laugh. "Perfect timing." Scott huffed a breath. "Yeah." Another moment passed. "Can I crash here?" Garrett asked quietly. Half joking, half not. "I don't really want to walk back in this." Scott's heart stumbled, but he nodded. "Yeah, stay." They climbed onto the narrow bed, lying on top of the blankets, fully clothed. Garrett on his back at first, Scott angled toward him. In the dark, their hands found each other. Garrett's fingers laced with Scott's, squeezing gently as thunder rolled across the sky. At some point, Scott wasn't sure when, Garrett shifted closer. Their thighs pressed together fully, warm and solid, no space left between them. Later still, Garrett's head drifted onto Scott's chest, breath warm through Scott's shirt. Scott's arms wrapped around him instinctively, holding him like something precious. Garrett whispered something into Scott's shirt that he didn't catch. His body softened, tension melting away. Scott stayed awake long after Garrett's breathing deepened into sleep. His own eyes stung from the mix of joy, fear, longing, and guilt swirling through him. He was holding the boy he loved, but he wasn't allowed to want this. Lightning flashed across the room. Scott tightened his arms just a little. Gray morning light seeped through the curtains. Rain still tapped softly against the window. Garrett woke slowly, warm, comfortable, head rising and falling with Scott's steady breaths. He blinked. He was half sprawled over Scott's chest, Scott's arm draped around him. Scott's lips were parted slightly in sleep, lashes dark and soft against his cheeks, hair mussed on the pillow. Garrett stared. Something warm unfurled in his chest, a quiet, steady warmth he didn't recognize. Not the jittery excitement he'd had in past relationships, not the pressure of expectations, something calm, something grounding, something like home. This, he thought. This is what Olivia meant. He eased himself up carefully, not wanting to wake Scott. He hesitated only a moment before leaning down. He pressed a very soft, almost not kiss into Scott's hair, a breath more than a touch, a promise without words. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he slipped out of the room as quietly as he'd come. Scott woke minutes later, fingers brushing the warmth left on his pillow. His heart thudded painfully. He stared at the empty room and wondered if stopping that almost kiss had saved them, or ruined his only chance. Chapter 4. If you touch me like that again. I won't stop. Scott tried to convince himself he was doing the right thing. Over the next few days, he perfected the art of avoidance. He arrived to class early enough to take a seat in the far corner. He kept his head down, hoodie pulled up, pretending to be absorbed in notes he'd already memorized. When Garrett texted, Scott answered with one-word replies. Yeah, maybe. Busy. Hating himself with every message sent. And every time he glanced up, Garrett was already looking for him. Their eyes met across the lecture hall once. Garrett's brows pinched together with confusion and worry. Scott ripped his gaze away so hard he almost gave himself whiplash. He wasn't trying to hurt him. He just had to protect them both. Because the memory of Garrett's head on his chest, the warmth, the closeness, the almost kiss, had burned itself into Scott's ribs. It felt too good, too possible, too dangerous. Garrett deserved clarity, stability, time to heal. Not Scott's trembling heart and fear of doing the wrong thing, but Garrett didn't understand any of that, not when Scott refused to explain. At lunch one afternoon, Olivia bumped into Garrett outside the library. She wore her hair up in a loose ponytail and looked unexpectedly like she'd been worried about him. Hey, she said gently, touching his forearm. Are you okay? Garrett forced a smile. Yeah, just school. Olivia tilted her head. You're a bad liar. He huffed a laugh because she was right. Olivia glanced around, then lowered her voice, gaze steady. Whoever you're scared of losing, maybe try not to push them away. Garrett blinked, breath catching. Liv. She held up a hand, smile small but sincere. We're not together anymore, Garrett, but I still care about you, and I can tell when you're hurting. He swallowed hard. He's avoiding me. Olivia's eyebrows rose just a fraction. Ah, then go talk to him. Garrett hesitated only half a heartbeat. Then he nodded, and for the first time in days, he looked like he knew exactly what he needed to do. Scott tried slipping out a side exit after class, backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds halfway in. He just needed to make it to the stairs. Then he could vanish into the crowd. But arms wrapped around his chest? No. Worse. Scott, Garrett's voice. Scott froze mid-step. He turned, expecting distance. What he got instead was Garrett closing the space between them in 3 quick strides. Garrett's hand braced on the wall beside Scott's head, trapping him, not aggressively but undeniably, between the lockers and the heat of his body. His other hand hovered uncertainly near Scott's waist, like he wanted to hold him but wasn't sure if he was allowed. Why are you avoiding me? Garrett asked, voice low and rough around the edges. Scott stared at the floor. I'm not. Scott, Garrett said again, closer now, breath brushing Scott's cheek. Talk to me. Scott felt his resolve tremble. He couldn't do this. Not with Garrett so close. Not with the memory of that almost kiss swirling like smoke around them. Garrett's jaw clenched. Did I cross a line that night? In your room? Because if I did, I'm sorry. I never want to hurt you. Scott's heart twisted. No, you didn't. Then what? Garrett stepped closer, their chests just shy of touching. I felt like something happened. Something real. And then you vanished. Scott squeezed his eyes shut. I'm terrified, okay? Garrett's breath hitched. Of what? Scott forced himself to meet his gaze. Of being a rebound, he whispered. Of messing up your life. Of giving you something you think you want now and making you regret it later. The words spilled out, raw and painful. Garrett stared at him, stunned. Then he moved, slowly, deliberately, until their chests brushed. Scott, he murmured, every syllable trembling with emotion. I didn't leave Olivia for you. Scott swallowed, throat tight. But, Garrett continued, softer now, I'd be lying if I said you didn't help me realize what I actually want. Scott's breath caught. Garrett still wasn't touching him, not fully, but the heat between them was unmistakable. I was drawn to you long before the breakup, Garrett admitted, voice almost a whisper. The way you think, the way you care, the way you make everything feel honest. Scott blinked against the sudden sting in his eyes. And when I'm with you, Garrett said, I can breathe. The words hit Scott with the force of a storm. And he could see it. Garrett wasn't performing. He wasn't playing. He wasn't confused. He was choosing. Scott trembled, torn between wanting and fearing. Garrett lowered his voice to a whisper. Just, please don't run from me. Scott's voice broke. I'm not running. I'm just scared. Garrett's expression softened. Then let's be scared together. They slipped into the nearest empty lecture hall, letting the door click shut. The large room felt cavernous in the dimmed lights, shadows stretching between the rows of seats. The air hummed with silence, private, charged, sacred. Garrett turned to him, hands shaking slightly. Scott, he said, voice unsteady, I need you to really hear this. Scott's back hit the edge of the lecturer's desk without him realizing he'd backed up. Garrett didn't touch him, but he stepped into his space, close enough that Scott could feel the warmth radiating from his chest. I want you, Garrett breathed. Not because I'm hurt, not because I'm lonely, because I'm finally not lying to myself. Scott's lungs forgot how to function. And, Garrett added, because I think I've been falling for you, longer than I admitted. Scott's eyes burned. A tremor ran through him, and his voice came out cracked. I've been in love with you for months. Garrett inhaled sharply. That was all it took. The tension between them snapped. Garrett reached out, cupping Scott's face with both hands, thumbs brushing along his cheekbones. His touch was warm, trembling, reverent. Scott leaned into it like gravity. The first kiss came softly, Garrett's lips brushing his in a question. Scott answered with a yes. He kissed back, hands sliding into Garrett's shirt, fisting the fabric as Garrett deepened the kiss. Their mouths moved in a slow, intoxicating rhythm that made Scott's knees weaken. Garrett pressed him gently back against the desk, bodies aligning. Scott's back arched slightly. Garrett's hands slid down to his waist, fingers warm and firm as they gripped him, pulling him closer, close enough that Scott could feel the tremor in his breath. The kiss grew hungrier, deeper, lips parting, breath shared. Scott's fingers curled tight in Garrett's shirt, tugging him closer still. Heat flooded every inch of him. They only stopped when their breaths were ragged. Foreheads pressed together, hearts racing wildly. Scott whispered, voice trembling, If you touch me like that again, I won't want to stop. Garrett's answering smile was soft but undeniably hungry. Good, Scott shivered. Garrett brushed a thumb along his lower lip. I don't want you to stop. I just want us to choose when. Later that night, Garrett invited him over. Scott's heart slammed against his ribs as he stepped into the small apartment. It smelled like detergent and peppermint tea, like warmth and home. Garrett tossed his keys into a bowl and turned with a sheepish grin. Want to attempt dinner? I make no promises. They tried. They failed spectacularly. A pan of vegetables ended up smoking. The smoke alarm chirped. Garrett nearly dropped a pot. Scott laughed until he doubled over. They ended up eating cold cereal, shoulders touching on the counter, both of them breathless and soft around the edges. Then they moved to the couch, a movie playing but forgotten almost instantly. Scott ended up sitting between Garrett's legs, back pressed to Garrett's chest. Garrett's arms wrapped around him, warm and secure, Fingers splayed over Scott's stomach beneath the hoodie. Scott melted back into him. Garrett pressed a slow kiss to the side of Scott's neck, a ghost of a touch with far too much power. Scott's breath caught. Garrett smiled against his skin. Scott turned his head, and Garrett met his lips halfway. The kiss deepened quickly. Scott twisted, shifting to straddle Garrett's lap, knees bracketing his thighs. Garrett's hands slid under Scott's shirt, palms warm against his skin, thumbs stroking slow circles at his hips. Scott's hands slipped under Garrett's t-shirt, fingers tracing the lines of muscle, skin hot beneath them. They kissed until their lips were swollen, until breath came in soft gasps, until Scott felt dizzy with wanting. They rocked gently against each other, fully clothed, heat rising, breathless and impossibly close. Garrett broke the kiss with effort, panting softly. He rested his forehead against Scott's shoulder, trying to steady himself. "I want you so much," he said, voice raw, "but I want to do this right." Scott pressed his face into Garrett's hair, breathing him in. "I want that too." They talked quietly, honestly, tangled together on the couch. They agreed they were dating now, that they would take their time, that their first night would be chosen, not rushed, not messy, but theirs. Later, Scott drifted against Garrett's chest, exhaustion mixing with contentment. Garrett's arms wrapped around him protectively, one hand curled at his waist, thumb tracing small, gentle circles. They fell asleep like that, tangled, warm, safe, chosen. Chapter 5. Our first night. I choose you. The weeks that followed settled around them like warm light, soft, steady, quietly miraculous. For Scott, every day felt like stepping into something he'd never thought possible. For Garrett, it felt like breathing fully for the first time in years. They were boyfriends. Not secret. Not unsure. Not almost. Boyfriends. And life shifted in small, unmistakable ways. In the library, Scott worked on his laptop while Garrett sat beside him, their fingers laced under the table where no one could see. Except Garrett would tug their joined hands onto his thigh whenever Scott tried hiding them again, gently but stubbornly. Scott would blush. Garrett would grin like it was the most natural thing in the world. Scott started wearing Garrett's hoodie. Not just occasionally, often. The garment was soft from years of wear, dark navy, too big on him in the coziest way, smelling faintly of Garrett's warm cologne and detergent. The first time Scott arrived to class wearing it, Garrett's eyes softened so much he nearly forgot to sit down before the lecture began. Garrett waited outside Scott's exam rooms. Every time. Leaning against the wall with a coffee in hand, scrolling something mindlessly on his phone until Scott emerged, anxious and exhausted. Then, Garrett would pull him in by the waist and press a kiss to his forehead, murmuring, "You did amazing," before Scott could even speak. The soft, intimate gesture made Scott's heart trip over itself every single time. One afternoon, Olivia spotted them walking across campus hand in hand. Scott nearly yanked his hand away on instinct, but Garrett didn't let him. Olivia saw them, smiled, not bittersweet, not hurt, but genuinely, and waved. Later that night, she texted Garrett, "I'm glad you found your steady." Garrett stared at the message for a long time, thumb tracing over the screen as though the words mattered more than they should. Scott saw the lingering look on Garrett's face and whispered, "What is it?" Garrett kissed Scott's temple and murmured, "Nothing bad. Just someone happy for me." It took time, slow, patient, gentle time, but Scott began to believe this was real, that he wasn't a mistake, that he wasn't a shadow or second choice or temporary comfort. He was wanted, chosen, loved, and he finally allowed himself to feel it. One evening, Scott got a text from Garrett that simply read, "No studying. Just us. Tonight, come over." Scott stared at it, heart racing. There were no emojis, no jokes, just intention. Something pulled tight in his chest. He replied, "Yes, I'm coming." The sky was soft blue fading into violet as Scott walked to Garrett's apartment. His hands were shoved into his pockets to hide how they trembled. When he reached the door, he hesitated only half a second before knocking. Garrett opened almost instantly, as though he'd been waiting right behind it. He wore a fitted black t-shirt and jeans, simple but unfairly distracting. His blonde hair was slightly tousled, his hazel eyes warm and nervous all at once. He rubbed a hand on the back of his neck, a rare show of shyness. "Hey," he murmured. Scott stepped inside, and stopped. Fairy lights were strung along the wall, gentle gold. Soft music played from a speaker, something low and warm and rhythmic. On the small table, Garrett had set 2 plates and a modest but clearly heartfelt meal, pasta, salad, a candle flickering between them. Scott's breath caught. "You did all this?" Garrett shrugged, flushing just a little. I wanted tonight to feel like something we chose, together. Scott's chest ached. He moved closer. It does. Dinner was full of easy laughter. Garrett teasing him about his terrible time management, Scott teasing him right back about his horrendous ability to multitask. Their knees brushed under the table, their feet tangled without meaning to. Their hands found each other and stayed intertwined for so long, Scott forgot what his fingers felt like alone. When they finished and cleared the plates, Garrett took Scott's hand across the table, thumb circling his palm in small, soothing motions. His voice softened. I've been with people before, he said carefully, but I've never wanted someone like this. Scott swallowed. Like what? Garrett leaned closer, eyes searching his. Not just your body. I want your whole life tangled with mine. I want the mornings and the nights and the quiet in between. I want us. Scott's breath wavered. Heat rushed through him. Not sharp, but warm, like pulling on a blanket just out of the dryer. I'm scared, Scott whispered. But I'm ready, because it's you. Garrett's hand tightened around his. Come with me. He led Scott into the bedroom. The lamp was dim, casting soft amber across the room. Fresh sheets lay folded down. The air felt thick with anticipation, but not pressure, never pressure. Scott stood there, heart pounding, feeling the moment expand around him like a held breath. Garrett approached slowly, lifting a hand to cup Scott's jaw. His thumb traced along Scott's cheekbone, gentle and reverent. Scott leaned into it instinctively. Their lips brushed, soft, exploring, almost shy despite everything they'd already shared. Garrett kissed him again, deeper this time. Coaxing, savoring. Scott responded with a trembling sigh, his hands rising to rest on Garrett's hips. They moved toward the bed without breaking the kiss. Garrett's hands slid under Scott's shirt, fingertips tracing up his spine, warm and slow and deliberate. Scott shivered, arching into the touch. Clothes came off in unhurried motions. Shirts tugged over heads, fabric brushing skin, the bare outline of shoulders and chest revealed in silhouette. They didn't rush. They didn't fumble. They explored gently, breathlessly, memorizing each other with fingertips and lips. Garrett's skin was warm beneath Scott's palms. Scott's skin tingled everywhere. Garrett's hands wandered, down his back, along his sides, settling at his waist as if anchoring him. They lay down together, bodies pressing close, skin sliding against skin. Garrett trailed kisses along Scott's throat, down to the hollow of his collarbone. Scott arched, a soft, breathy sound escaping him that made Garrett's hand tighten on his waist. The room filled with warmth, the rustle of sheets, the quiet rise and fall of their breaths, the whisper of their voices as they checked in with each other between kisses. Is this okay? Garrett murmured against Scott's skin. Yes, Scott breathed, fingers curling in Garrett's hair. More than okay. Garrett nuzzled Scott's neck, lips brushing softly. You're sure? Scott lifted his head, pressing their foreheads together. I've never been more sure. The lamp cast their silhouettes onto the wall, two bodies moving slowly, intimately, as gentle as the music playing in the background. The narrative of their bodies blurred into warmth and shadow, into murmured praise and soft gasps, into touches that spoke louder than words ever could. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was intentional, tender, deeply earned. When the moment came, it wasn't fire. It wasn't fire. It was sunrise, slow, growing warmth that filled every empty space inside them. Later, when the room was quiet and the lamp dimmed to a soft glow, Scott lay with his head on Garrett's chest. Garrett's arm was wrapped around him, thumb stroking lazy, affectionate patterns on his shoulder. Their legs were tangled under the sheets, the remains of the night humming quietly in their bones. Garrett pressed a kiss to Scott's forehead. It was warm and grounding and achingly gentle. You were never invisible to me, he murmured. Scott lifted his head slightly. What? Garrett smiled, small and crooked. From the first time you raised your hand in class and argued with the professor, I thought, I want to know him. Scott's eyes stung. I thought you'd never notice me. Garrett shook his head, brushing Scott's hair back from his forehead. I didn't just notice you. I fell for you so slowly, I didn't realize until you were all I thought about. Scott's breath hitched, and he buried his face in Garrett's chest, overwhelmed by love so soft it almost hurt. Garrett held him tighter, pressing another kiss to his hair. Morning sunlight spilled across the bed, striping the sheets in gold. Garrett woke first, watching as Scott blinked awake, hair tousled, eyes soft with sleep. They shared slow, sleep-must kisses, No urgency, just tenderness, warmth, and the sweetness of familiarity. They dressed piecemeal, stealing kisses between tugging on shirts and buttoning jeans. Garrett paused to tuck Scott's hair behind his ear before pulling his hoodie over his head. When they stepped onto campus, the world felt different. Brighter. Truer. They walked hand in hand across the quad. Some people looked surprised. Some smiled knowingly. Some didn't react at all. Scott started to pull his hand back. Instinct, shyness, old fears clinging to his ribs. Garrett tightened his grip instead. Just a small lift of their intertwined hands, a quiet declaration. This is us. Scott looked up at him. Garrett's hazel eyes shone with something fierce and devoted. Pride, affection, love. In that moment, Scott remembered the boy he'd been at the beginning of the semester, the one who thought he'd fallen for someone who would never see him. Now, walking beside Garrett in full daylight, their hands intertwined like a promise, he realized the truth. Garrett had been falling right back, step by step, touch by touch, breath by breath, until they arrived here, together.